Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm speaking to an entrepreneur who is helping companies to manage human risk by thinking about, this will surprise you, humans. The approach they're adopting is somewhat unusual, which is why I think it's worth exploring on the show. My guest, Jennifer Thamm, is the founder of Says Life. They help companies to mitigate human risk at a leadership level by providing senior executives with a service that helps them to manage stress in their lives. When I say lives, I mean personal and business. Says Life works with the senior leader to help them identify where stress might arise and arrange appropriate support for them and their families, whether or not it's directly work-related. They also provide the employer with anonymised aggregated data on the human risks facing their leadership, so the company can look to address the aspects it can control. The reason I wanted to explore this is that the approach recognises a number of aspects of work which we all intuitively know to be true, but which are often ignored. Just because someone is in a senior position with lots of industry experience doesn't mean they don't need psychological support to do their role. In fact, they might need more of it. And what influences human decision-making inside work can be heavily influenced by what is happening outside of it. Now, historically, these things have been difficult for companies to explore, both because the data wasn't available, but equally because of understandable privacy concerns on the part of leaders who might want to keep their private lives private. So, lots to explore in my discussion with Jennifer Thamm on managing leadership stress. Jennifer, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Hi, Christian. How are you?
I am very well, and I'm really happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Now, look, I know who you are, but many of my listeners might not. Can you give us a little pen portrait about yourself?
Sure. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer. I am born and raised in Southern California, and I've been living in Zurich, Switzerland for the last 16 years. I'm a mom of two little ones. I have a 2-year-old and 3-year-old. I'm a wife, and I've been working in risk and insurance and banking for the last 20 years. And recently I've become an entrepreneur where I've launched a new business focused on leadership, well-being, and their people risk management issues.
We met in your previous life.
Right.
Obviously in financial services, as in many other industries, he said, pointing to the name of the podcast, human risk plays a key component. So when things go wrong, there's that human element either causing the problem or making it worse by the way they react to it. And so it's that piece of it that you've taken in your entrepreneurial work. And so can you talk a little bit about the thinking to, shifting out of that space and how you've taken that, for want of a better phrase, human risk concept into what you do now?
Yeah, well, I really was focused on risk and transformation in my previous life and then the corporate world. And over 20 years, I kept seeing a repetitive theme come up where all of the issues and loss events that were occurring in our company were really, if you did a root cause, were always driven by someone's behavior, someone's decision or lack of decision, or some sort of people topic. And it was very difficult for me to actually address that in my latter years of working as a risk professional because, people's behavior can be driven by many different things. And there were some events in my corporate career with some of our leaders that really led me to look at this topic in more detail. So I went and did my MBA dissertation on executive level stress because I really wanted to understand what was driving primarily our leaders to be behaving in the way that they do. And I wanted to make sure that our leadership was placed as best possible to perform as well as they can on the job because they're people too. And there's always this saying, it's lonely at the top, right? And through all the interviews that I conducted with executives, it seems that is definitely the case. That's what I had in my primary research. It really is lonely at the top. And I felt that there needed to be more focus from a risk perspective on how to address, measure, and manage going forward the delicate issues of leadership, people risks to the organization. And it's taboo, but it's nothing negative. Everyone's human, right? Even if you're the CEO, you're still a human being. And so I feel it's a disservice to that man or woman at the top to expect that they should not behave like a human being. We really have to give them the support that they need, and it needs to be private and it needs to be bespoke and customized to them. And because the whole stress and risks around their people behavior can be holistic, meaning that those stressors could come from many different things that are outside of the office. I wanted to have a company that really focused on people risks, that was anonymous and gave autonomy to that leader privately, separate to their corporation, but also addressed the topics outside of the company. So we also look at their family and would give the whole family and household support to that leader as well at the same time. And over time, I just think that we really need to address the people topics before we can then have the follow-on risks and issues addressed, which are more procedural. Because unless you correct the people behavior, you're always going to have these procedural issues.
And I find this fascinating because there's an implicit presumption that, I don't know, if somebody's got a ton of experience, right? They've been in an industry for a long time. They've been in, had various positions in doing that. They will automatically be equipped to be a leader. And we've seen lots of examples. I think financial services is a really good one, where actually being good at the job doesn't necessarily mean that you're good at leading people and that you've got all of the skills. So you might have got there from a technical perspective, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're somebody that can handle these issues. And even if you're really good at these, there are going to be, to your point, flaws that individual has, because we're all human. And so what you're doing is saying, let's be honest about this and recognize that people are going to face challenges, whoever they are, whatever their experience is. Mm-hmm. And therefore, we're going to help to identify what those might be and to basically support people in that journey to not correct those things, but help people to manage the particular dynamics that are there. And you're doing this not just in the work sphere, but you're also looking and saying we have to recognize that human beings' personal lives will come into work.
Right.
To the sense that we don't suddenly become a different person walking through the door. If we've had an argument with our partner or something's going wrong domestically,
right,
there's a challenge there. So that's really looking at that piece. I mean, that's blowing open quite a lot of sort of myths, which is one, that you were a different person at work. We can segment our lives nicely. Secondly, that experience must be valuable in a leadership position. Mm-hmm. And thirdly, that leaders are infallible, and a whole lot of other things. I mean, you're really kind of challenging some orthodoxy there.
I guess so. But I mean, through my experience, it's just practical. It seems to be very simple, because I don't like to look at, like you said, a separation between church and state, as Americans would say. We tend to think that when we enter the doors to work, everything that's happened to our lives previously, including what happened to us when we were 2 and 3 years old, do not come into a subconscious perspective of how we approach our daily activities in the office.
Because we're quote unquote professional.
Because it's a professional environment. You need to behave professionally. And that's true. You do need to behave professionally. But what I see is that, there's a lot of focus going on right now on well-being and wellness and performance, person's performance, top leadership performance, and so forth. In order to address that, you might need to address things that have happened to this person when they were a child, because their performance is being blocked by something that had happened in the past. And that's none of the company's business. But what the company does want is they are paying a lot of money for that leader to perform well at their job. And so there needs to be a private and secure way that leader can have trust in a program that follows a practice where we can have like a customized way of addressing what they need as the support tools and support people to help them on their journey to be the best leader. And that might be a therapist. It might be a financial coach. It might be a relationship coach. It might be a fitness coach, nutritionist, whatever that looks like. But our leaders, especially our top leaders, really need to have a holistic support team, giving them the background and giving them the tools that they need to perform the best they can in their organization. And then consequently, from a different perspective, is at the same time, the company needs to look at these people topics from a risk perspective. I wholeheartedly believe. So we spend a lot of time with financial risk and operational risk around different topics like theft, for example, or hazard risk, slip and fall, right? So we have a lot of procedures around that. And in the ways of measuring them and ways of monitoring them and making sure that we're preventive in terms of making sure that they don't happen. And so, why don't we take that same approach and apply that to a people and human behavior perspective? And so, that's all I've done. And with my company, is I've said, let's take our financial and our risk management standards and apply that in a people and human behavioral perspective and follow those procedures and follow that. And so, you have to be able to have leading indicators of what would be giving the corporation the most people stress related risks going forward. You have to have a way to measure them. You have to have a way to monitor them over time. You need to understand what your thresholds are. And when I mean thresholds, I mean, like, how much is the company willing to say, at what point is it okay for a person to be under X amount of stress from whether it be too much travel or whether it be moving from one job to another or moving companies or moving positions from one location to another. So what is it that the company is willing to absorb from a risk perspective? How much risk can they take on with regards to people topics? And then whatever they're not able to absorb, then they need to manage that properly.
It struck me as you were talking this idea is something that we see in the sporting arena. So if I take football, so soccer for my American friend, and I'm sure the same applies to other sports I'm less familiar with.
Okay.
Historically, it was a case of player come along, you do a bit of training with them, and then you hope that they turn up on the match day and perform. Yeah. Nowadays, we do medicals before clubs pay obscene amounts of money for players. Mm-hmm. We have financial coach because we recognize that somebody in their mid-20s who's being paid millions may not have the wherewithal to handle that. We think about their mental health.
Right.
And so they nurture these assets that they have paid for in the same way that you would nurture a plant or maybe maybe a plant in any sense, right? Machinery as well as the physical plant.
Yeah.
And so they've built this infrastructure that really recognizes, okay, we've hired these people to perform on the pitch, but actually if their home lives are a mess, or they've got a gambling problem, or they've got physical, that is all dealt with now. And so they've built this infrastructure around it. And so it really seems to me what you're doing is saying, well, actually, even if your job doesn't involve kicking a ball around a field of grass and doing, representing us in sort of ad campaigns for fashion houses, you are a human capital, and we need to think of you in the same way. And so we need to look at this particular piece and say, okay, if we're employing people, they come with a load of dynamics, and there's some good dynamics and some bad dynamics, and we need to maximize the good, get the best out of the people. And so what you're sort of saying is, let's be honest about this, recognize that, and take something that works in that physical, in that sporting environment.
Right.
And therefore we're encroaching on something here because it doesn't feel like it's any of their business. It's kind of like you can, when we hire people, we'll do a little bit of what do you like as an individual, but we'll look at your work experience and we'll look at that professional side of it. And you're opening that broader piece and saying you're employing human capital. How do we get the best out of that human capital, mitigate the risk that human capital poses? Well, the answer is we start to get into the realm of some of those sort of sporting processes.
Right. I mean, when you bring up a sports team, what's also an interesting dynamic at a corporate risk level is that the leadership team are sometimes pitted against each other. And what I mean by that is not necessarily in a sinister way, but their objectives might be defined for them as such, where they actually end up competing against each other instead of joining together, forming a bond, and then competing against the competitors externally, right? So they spend so much time focusing on managing their peers.
Right.
And that takes a toll on you. It spends so much energy of your emotional and physical continuity to just show up that day. You get in a fight with your spouse maybe in the morning, you show up, and then you got to get in a fight with your peer. How much does that suck? Right. And this is supposed to be basically your buddy, right? You should go and you don't necessarily have to like them, but being that they're your team, I mean, teammate, right? So I grew up playing sports, playing team sports. I played soccer growing up, I played softball growing up, and ice hockey, right? So I'm a very team oriented person. And I never understood that when I went into the office, I didn't have that same team camaraderie. In some cases, I have, sometimes you get a dream team and you work really well together and, things are flying and you feel great. So, how can we replicate that feeling, so how can we remove some of those people related risks that create an environment where our leaderships are they don't feel like they can be a teammate to their peers on their team. And I think, you talk about a lot of the individual support that a professional sports athlete receives. Well, they also get a lot of team collaboration support, how to work together, how to support each other, how to read each other, how to be there when the other needs you. And I haven't seen a lot of that translate into the corporate environment.
And I'm giggling because we've all been on, I say we've all, most people who've worked in particularly larger organizations will be in sort of away days or team action, and there'll be some kind of thing that you do together. And it might have a community, and maybe it's painting a school or something, or doing some kind of outbound adventure thing. And the way the problem is solved, we'll send you on one of these, right? And then you'll be fixed, right? So we'll get you to do something, go through some experience, many of which are hideous. Sometimes they're fun, but they're hideous experiences, right? And you come back and you sort of go, yeah, okay, great. We had fun when we were running around the forest, but like that's where it stops. And you're really looking at this and saying, this is really important that we have that sense. So I think what you're tapping into is something that everybody understands, right? Because there are a lot of processes that are designed to tick that box, right? So we know we need to be seen to be doing these things. So let's have an offsite or an away day or some sort of bonding exercise, and that'll solve the problem. And then we can get back to the day job. So there's an intuitive understanding that this sort of thing ought to exist. And you're saying, well, actually, let's make that real,
right? And
let's do something that is actually delivering that on the ground.
Yeah, and also it's more important to know, is it the right activity? So they tick the box, we tick the box a lot on the corporate wellness program, for the employees, or the away day for, to build the leadership team and so forth. But actually, was it the right activity? So what I like to focus on is identifying what the root cause of those issues are, and then applying the right type of mitigation. Because, if your issue is people keep walking into the bathroom and slipping and falling on a puddle of water, you're not going to go in and say, oh, okay, well, our mitigation is going to be to install a bunch of hand blow dryers. Right? So you have to understand where the problem's coming from and then apply the right mitigation. So maybe an offsite, where everyone closes their eyes and you fall backwards and then someone has to catch you. Maybe that's not the right thing. Maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe everybody needs to go swimming in cold water together or something like that. But the point is that if you're properly trying to address human and people risks in an organization, you need to follow the right type of process. And just automatically applying the Band-Aid of let's have the wellness day, the offsites and so forth, it should be curated to the point where you understand what you're really mitigating. You know what I mean? And do spend the money. I mean, the company, everyone's cost cutting, right? So spend the money on activities that are going to address that root cause.
That cost cutting point, I think, is worth reflecting on, because it's seen as a discretionary cost, this broad area. Whereas if you had a factory full of equipment and that equipment was breaking down, right, you could visibly see it wasn't functioning. The robot wasn't putting the part in the car in the right place. You would spend the money to fix that.
Right.
But yet humans, we somehow, partly because sometimes it's invisible, but we also sort of just go, we can do without that. That's a nice thing to do. In good times, right, we will have all these events to deal with this problem. Bad time, we can't afford that anymore. And I look at it and say, if you were any other form of asset in the organization where you saw that asset wasn't performing, you would do something about it. And more to the point, if you don't go down this route of looking at human beings, and it may look like it's functioning.
Yeah.
I mean, the phrase functioning alcoholics are a really good example of this, right? So people function,
Yeah, right.
But underneath it all, there's a ton of things going on. So it looks like the human robot is performing okay, but actually underneath is a major problem, and you're just storing up trouble. And I find it fascinating that when it comes to spending money on human beings, that's discretionary in many cases. When it comes to spending on physical assets, well, that's a must-have.
Yeah, I mean, that's funny. I mean, I think the reason why, as you mentioned before, it's very difficult to measure the costs of whether we call it human error or people problems or leadership stress, it doesn't matter, but it's very difficult to measure that and quantify it. Whereas if you're looking at a robot, they clearly spend money on maintenance as a preventative measure. And if it's something breaks, they spend money on fixing it, right? So why don't we do that to our people and particularly our leadership? I mean, and there are measurements out there. So, for example, the European Trade Union has estimated that the cost of depression from work in the EU is over $600 billion. $600 billion. So there are measurements out there that certain unions and certain organizations are applying to this, but it's not necessarily carried in and used regularly in the office place. One of the difficulties I had internally as a risk manager is that, I always worked in financial services. So these types of risks, people risks, weren't required. They weren't, they're not required by the regulators. So you're not going to spend money identifying, preventing, and managing a risk that's the regulators don't care about.
That's an interesting articulation. You're right. There isn't a kind of prescription in there from the regulator that says you ought to be looking at mental health. You ought to be looking at people's. But what I find fascinating about that is, the regulators don't do that. But people should be working this out for themselves, right? If you are running your business just purely on what the rules say, you're effectively outsourcing your responsibilities to the regulator. And of course, that is safe from a regulatory perspective today, but you're always going to be behind the curve because you're going to be waiting for what they're bringing out now. Whereas if you were thinking ahead, you'd be going, well, it is kind of predictable where regulators will go. And you might not like it, it might be costly, but you could look ahead. So this idea that we run our businesses based on the extrinsic motivator of what the regulator says, right, is incredibly dangerous. We should be doing this stuff from an internal perspective and thinking.
We should be proactive, right?
What do we think is important?
Right.
How do we get the return on our investment in human capital?
Exactly.
What's the best way, because we're spending a ton of money on it, particularly in financial services. How do we do?
Yeah.
And then let's worry about how that ticks the regulatory box afterwards, and you might have some small gaps to close and some performative things you need to do. But the benefit then is you can stand behind it, it's authentic, and the chances are you will be well ahead of where the regulator gets to. And guess what? This is the other bit I love, is when the regulator looks around and says, right, we better do something on, I don't know, mental health or some issue, right? They will look around the industry and go, who is doing this well? And de facto, if you are thinking in those, they'll go, well, everybody should be doing this. This is best. You are then owning best practice. And that's a lot cheaper than continuing to barrel down a particular road and then realizing that you've got a whole load of other things to do that the regulators suddenly imposed that you didn't see coming. And so I think your articulation is really interesting. It's that extrinsic, people view it and like, well, if the regulator requires it, we'll do it. And until they do, we won't do it. I think it's really dangerous because it feels safe, but it's not. You're constantly chasing the thing. And we can work this stuff out, right? We can see where the direction of travel is.
And, it is, do we need to calculate that in our solvency ratios? Yes or no? No? Oh, okay. Well, that's plan B. We'll move on to something that we do need to calculate, right? And include. But, when it comes to the cost of the organization and why we're not being proactive about maintaining and, our humans and our human capital. It's crazy. I always joke that, and make an analogy, if we had purchased a whole bunch of very, very expensive racehorses, and then we put them in a room in their stall all together and applied a whole bunch of unnecessary stressors to them. I don't know, flicking the lights on once in a while, on and off. Loads of noise, right? We didn't feed them well. We didn't take them out for their exercise every day. We didn't give them the hygiene that they needed. And then it's race day. How fast do we expect those horses to race? Probably not very fast, right? We would never do that. You would never pay astronomical amounts of money for top of the line racehorses and then treat them poorly. But yet we do that in a corporate environment. Why do we pay millions of dollars for our top leaders and then put them in these terrible positions, you know?
It makes no sense whatsoever. But as you say, it's because there's that human thing, and well, they'll kind of work it out, and I don't know. We almost we place it in a way. It's placing huge amounts of trust for, frankly, not very good reason, because everybody's human, in people's ability to be able to handle this.
Right.
And I think that's a really interesting inbuilt presumption around things operate, which is just, well, we'll give you the title and we'll give you a big office and we'll give you an entourage to help you sort that stuff out, and you'll be okay. And as you say, any other form of asset, you wouldn't do that.
No, you wouldn't. And if you apply it into a different context, you just wouldn't do that. That's why I like the racehorse analogy, because racehorses are expected to bring in a return on investment. They're expected to perform, and they're expected to bring in money for you. And in order to prepare them to the best of their abilities to do that for you and give and increase the probability of your ROI to be as high as possible, then you take really good care of that horse. So I would like to see that we do the same with all of our top leaders, because if the leadership isn't performing well, then, their stuff will just travel downhill to all the rest of everybody. And I know there's a lot of pressure. There's been talk of like middle managers, so they get the pressure from the bottom, they get the pressure from the top, and they don't get the financial rewards, right? Well, that is the case. However, we still can't forget that the top leadership is really shaping that strategy and that culture for those middle managers. So to help those middle managers out, even though they're not getting the financial rewards as the top leaders are, we still need to give the best amount of support to the top leadership to be able to create that culture and environment to reduce the stress and the people risks. But that's why I founded my company, because I really wanted to focus on a risk-based perspective of how to address, manage, monitor all of these people risks going forward, and giving the right type of supplemental support based on the findings to reduce the amount of money wasted on team outbound experiences and things like that. No, spend your money on the right type of mitigation and management that you need in your particular company, and maybe for that particular person.
I was giggling because I was thinking it'd be a bit like having the traditional approach is a bit like you got a doctor, so you have and everybody goes to see that doctor and they all get the same prescription. Right, you wouldn't, you wouldn't do that, right?
And you wouldn't
diagnose what's going on, and you need these particular pills, and you're not getting these pills, right? Because even though you've got the same thing, there's a side effect here that is really significant, given you.
Right.
And so I think that's fascinating. So it's probably worth talking a little bit about what you actually do, because I think this is the really interesting. Can you just talk about how does the process work?
Good question. So for our company, Says Life, what we do is, first of all, we'll provide anonymous measurements and assessment for the individual person on their holistic life balance. So you really look at your return on investment of your lifestyle. So what you're putting into your life is what you're getting out of it, making sense to you. And that's private to them. And then you can benchmark against somebody in your same, gendered role type of thing.
So what would an example be of this? So what sorts of things are you looking at here?
So we look at various different aspects of your life, from evaluating your health, so how you see yourself as well, how you spend your time during the day. So a lot of health basics. Then you look at various factors around money and financial health. Then you look at fun. So fun is a big perspective of life that somehow dropped out. You're not supposed to have fun anymore when you're an adult, right?
Yeah, I've never understood that, right? This is business. This is serious.
I know.
Hell no, right? All right.
And what was so funny to me is, I'm born and raised in Southern California. So there's a lot of cultural, I think, focus on health and well-being out there that maybe the rest of the world doesn't do. So, everyone's outside, it's sunny, you always want to work out, blah, 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 I always laugh because every time I go home from Zurich, there's at least one person a day asks me, did you go to the gym today? So coming from Southern California, it's fun to be outgoing. You want to be positive. You want to show confidence and you want to be happy. And then I came over to Europe and I found out that I wasn't supposed to have so much fun anymore in the office. And I had, I worked for a very large national insurance company in Los Angeles. And so insurance in America and insurance in Europe are looked at kind of like they're just different cultures around it. And I came from the Los Angeles office where we had some of our top leadership in the C-suite dressed up in blow up sumo outfits, those things. And then we had a fake ring out in the parking lot. We moved all the cars. We opened up a parking lot. The company drove in an In-N-Out burger food truck, but all the employees came out and we got to see our C-suite leaders sumo wrestle against each other. And people were like taking bets, of who was going to win, and we just pit it. It was hysterical. And the leaders were totally fine with having fun like that in the office. I remember coming over here and we were looking at what sort of activity we could do for employees and so forth. And I thought, would that activity work over here? Could we get that type of fun over here? And I'm not sure that would go over well in Europe.
But what I think is interesting there, and we need to come back to finish the way you do things. But what I think is interesting about that is that fun isn't a uniform thing, right?
Exactly.
And you have to make sure that what you're doing is authentic to a particular culture. And what I find really interesting is pick any culture you want on the planet.
Right.
They will have a sense of fun. There's a sense of levity there. There's a blowing off steam, doing things that are slightly ridiculous. So even in things that are tightly controlled, even religion has fun festivals and things that are engaging and entertaining. Mm-hmm. And so even the most kind of what looks like the most serious state culture will blow off steam through various mechanisms. So this idea of engaging the kind of lighter side, kind of if you like recapturing your inner child, I think exists all over. It just exists in different forms. I mean, I think Japan is fascinating because on the one hand you've got this kind of serenity. On the other hand, you've got stuff like there's ridiculous things that go on there, and that's why I love going there because you've got the sort of feng shui, silence, monastic side to it. And then you've got, karaoke and sumo and a whole load of other things that are just great fun.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think the point around, it doesn't always necessarily travel in the same way. And it's dangerous to assume that what you think is fun, other people think is automatically fun.
Right.
But I think this basic principle of catching things, how do we engage people on a visceral level that's going to spark their interest, that's going to make their eyes light up a bit, get them a bit of interest, make them, smiling is a universal human thing.
That is true.
And so to my mind, we should be looking to make people smile as much as we can because that is good for your health and good for the soul. Anyway, that was a distraction. Take us back.
So back to your question about what's involved in that assessment. So fun is a factor. So we look at things like fun, your relationships with yourself, your relationships with other people inside and outside of the office. And so it's a holistic perspective of various different areas that can cause a lot of stress to you potentially and how you're taking care of that. And then we evaluate your return on investment for what you're investing in your life and what you're getting out of it. And so we give you a risk score. That's a general score, and then you can do a deeper dive on any of those particular areas. And based off of your particular needs at that moment, then we match you with either therapists and or coaches for you and your family. And then you'll be able to have live coaching and live therapy sessions all through the mobile app. And then you also have some automated tools to help you along and so forth. And so what's important, though, for the leadership is that as time goes on and as they work on things, their needs could change. And so what we provide is an ever evolving support team based on their needs on an ongoing basis. And so we really want to look at what kind of measurements that individual has and how they can portray themselves. And then in addition, then we have the risk for the company. So we walk through an identification of what potential people risks that company might have. Some risks could pertain to one company and not to another. And so it's really that personalized view on people risks that company has, that identification. Then it walks through what type of thresholds they have. So not to be too nerdy, but I'd say how how much can we absorb? What are we okay with? Is it okay that our leaders are traveling 75% of the time? Or do we want them home a little bit more than that, right? So it's just that discussion. And then it's a way to report on those types of metrics. And then we have upfront agreements with the company. Should there be any issues with the individual person, we do not give any information to the company, but we already have agreements for, potentially that person might need additional coaching or additional therapy. And then we can manage that completely privately without the company even knowing with that particular person.
And so you're taking so from the individual's perspective, they get a kind of bespoke service. So it's a little bit like one of those lifestyle concierge services, but you're thinking about it from a mental health and a physical health, from a sort of that perspective.
Financial,
right?
Relationship health, right? We look at everything holistically.
Okay, so they get what they need, and then what you do, so the company doesn't see any of that particular the detail,
No,
but what you're
nothing.
doing is aggregating up the data that you get from individuals and saying,
Right.
this is now your company position.
To risk score.
So you need to manage that from a corporate perspective. And what I think is interesting about it is, of course, that you can have, when you look at it, in a way, the company sort of gets an average kind of landscape view.
Right.
And of course, the composition of that landscape might be very, very different. So I always think it's that classic trick of an average. Yeah, there may be no such thing as an average person. And so what you're really trying to do is to give them some actionable points and things without encroaching on anyone's privacy or personal things. So they're never seeing that side of it.
Exactly.
How does that aggregation process work? Because presumably you need to have a large enough number of people that are participating. If it was like 2 people, that might be a problem. Worst case, 1 person, right?
No, we can't do 1 person or 2. No, so we've said 10 people. So we have to have, if they want any sort of aggregate information, they need 10 people. But there isn't any minimum to look at what type of risks your corporation has. I mean, this is good practice anyway, whether it's a startup organization or a large 100-year-old organization. You should always have, an annual risk assessment to identify what you need to manage and prevent going forward for the oncoming year. And what needs to be included in that risk assessment are all your people risks. And so that's what our program does. It specializes in people-related, stress-related risks for preventative measures. And then it gives the corporation and the individual person to have a customized approach to manage whatever risks are coming on board going forward.
So there's a refresher, implicit in what you're saying, there's a refresher process that goes on. So you talked about people's needs changing.
The recommendation would be like every 3 to 6 months, they would retake their assessment. And it's a short assessment. The way we've designed it is very unique. So it's not a long, laborious, 60 question. It's right. But it gives it, you can track it over time. And then as your needs grow, my needs, my stressors now were far and away different than what they were 10 years ago. So, it really shapes towards your life. And when you join Says Life, then you're joining for life. And it doesn't matter what company you move to, or if you decide to leave the corporate life and become an entrepreneur, we'll still stay with you. And hopefully you'll be able to evolve better and perform at the levels that we would like to see those racehorses run at.
Talk us through a little bit around the science behind the questions, because I know there's a lot of, if you look at some of the traditional personality tests, there's been a lot of cynicism around those. So lots of companies have rolled out various models. I'm not going to name them because I don't want people to even look at them. There's some that have been absolutely debunked. How do you know that what you're doing is scientifically sound?
Through a lot of research, and then I worked with some very experienced psychologists and psychoanalysts and therapists that have been doing this for many years. And so I collaborated with them to make sure that the risk-based approach that I took, plus the financial standards that we applied in our calculations, were making sense from the mental health and physical health perspective. There's a lot of research actually done around the concept of stress itself. So I don't have their names on me right now, but through my dissertation, I had to really look at what is the theoretical scientific models of stress. and how that pertains to our life. We talk about resilience and so forth, and that resilience is when the stressor happens, then how can we bounce back to normal, whatever normal looks like, right? So based on a lot of these researched and scientific principles that have been proven over time, they've been studying this since the early 20th century. You can evaluate how to approach in a holistic perspective what components of life you should be able to measure. And then, as I mentioned before, what makes us unique is that our program unique is that we're following a risk approach. Now, ISO standards have outlined very clearly what a process should look like to manage your risks, from the identification to the communication and feedback loops, etc. So following those ISO standards, and now ISO also has now introduced a new ISO standard around health and well-being, corporate health and well-being. So, and ISO doesn't do a prescriptive, calculation one-to-one, but it's always given a very standardized guidance as to how procedures and how the operations around risk management should work. And so we've completely followed all of those guidelines, and everything that we're doing is based on that.
You've developed an approach. Presumably, is that evolving as you go? Are you adding new things in? I mean, it's because one of the things I think is fascinating about the way you talk about it is you recognize that, if I compare it to sort of some of these sort of personality tests, there's kind of like, do this test, this is who you are, bang, job done, right? And then you carry those, and there's one in particular that has the 4 letters. That
Yes,
I'm not going to dignify by naming it,
yeah.
but it's, you carry those letters with you. That is who you are.
That is who
and of course
you are.
we know that you've evolved your questionnaires.
Yeah.
Right, and your ways of engaging people. How are you thinking about evolving, I guess, the questions themselves and the processes that you use?
Not off the table, but you always want to make sure, our methodology and approach is to follow the standardized and recognized international standards around risk management and around health and well-being. So I wouldn't want to deviate away from that. So that would be the core foundation of everything that we do. In terms of an actual question of how it's worded and so forth, I would be open to addressing that in the future. However, we're a fairly new company. We just started last year. So I'm not at the point right now where I would want to change anything. And also, I've done a lot of measurements over the years working on corporate environment, performance reviews. I'm not talking about a person's performance review, but I mean, when you're doing your scorecards, your balance scorecards and so forth, do a lot of measurements. And what's always irked me is that the goalposts are always changed year to year. Right. And so it's very difficult to have a year-on-year comparison of what the performances look like. So I tend to shy away from changing the goalposts from year to year, particularly when a person wants to evaluate themselves of what they looked like, in January to what they look like in December, and then what they look like in the next year. If you change the goalposts for them, then, it's always been kind of a little bit of smoke and mirrors of how you tell the story.
Right, and I was thinking about that. That was kind of where I was going with the question, because you want a sort of level of consistency,
yes,
so that you're benchmarking the same thing. And if we look at, companies are very adept at, we'll report their accounting standards have changed, so we'll report them on a different basis, and we'll exclude this, or to get the story that we want. And of course, what you're trying to get to is the truth here,
right?
And so to a certain extent, changing the formula. Whilst it sounds to me like you're recognizing that one needs to just sort of move with the times. I'll put it in simple terms. You also want that solid benchmark, because if you're feeding back to people and organizations on a different basis each time, that's not a particularly helpful communications tool. And speaking of communicate, I mean, how do you communicate? So people fill in a questionnaire. How do you communicate that back to them? What's the process? What do they get?
So they'll get a report, an easy report, to see their risk-based score. And the way that we communicate actually is specific to that individual person. So the idea is that should a leader particularly not want to follow through, look at all their emails that they're getting. So we're not going to send them via email. We're going to send them a link through a text message. What's the easiest way? So as you said, we're a bespoke service, so, almost like a lifestyle concierge. For that C-suite leader, for those top executives, we want to be able to provide them and their family a way that is working for them and their needs. So someone's spouse might want an email or a phone call, but themselves, they just want a text message because that's all they can manage at the moment, right? And so they just do everything by text, and that's the way it works. So some leaders want something a little bit more hands-on, where they can talk to someone in person. Another might just want everything completely automated and done on their phone. So the way that we work as a service is to really identify what communication tools are best for that person, and we go with that. We'll check, to see if they need coaching sessions but don't make it. So it's a way to address, how do we approach that with them? Should we give them a phone call, or is that bothering them too much? Or should we, do we need to contact their assistant? Does their assistant need to book their sessions for them? Maybe that's the better solution in this particular case. So you really have to look for the individual. Again, I don't really like wasting money. So I take the approach, take the management measures, take the communication standards, and apply it in the best that's going to work and be useful for that particular person and for that company.
And if I were a senior leader and I've signed up for the service, how does this work on a practical level for an individual? So you've asked a senior leader to fill in all the questions, they get a report back. What might be an example of a specific issue that you would be able to help?
Well, I don't help them with anything specifically, but I direct them. Our whole program directs them to the right type of support team. So it might be a coach or a therapist that they would speak with, or their family members would speak with. So practically speaking, maybe their stresses that are coming out are around some family topics. So maybe they have got some teenagers and they're not connecting very well with this teenager for whatever reason, right? And so that's creating a lot of stress on the family unit, and then that carries into the office. So for that individual leader, their spouse, their family, they can work with relationship counselors, family counselors, and they would get that specific approach to help them work through their issues and strengthen the family unit and the household unit, right? Which would create, hopefully, a more happy feeling and less stress for that particular leader. None of that information would ever go to the company. They would never even know that this is a particular issue. None of the specifics around a particular leader would ever get to the company. What the company does get to see is the overall risk score for the aggregate team, either the leadership team, or if they want to scale up and they want to actually assess the whole company, then they can see that from the whole company or by department. They can see that any of the leading indicators that they've identified as people risks through the assessments, then the company would also be able to see what the performance is at a company level against those particular leading indicators and those risk scores on a quarterly basis.
And so that would help them to think about the drivers of that from an organizational perspective. So we recognize that we've got, presumably it's a little bit like concentration risk of any other kind.
It's the same process. So, if they're having a lot of issues around low performance, or let's take an example of an issue. So something that's already occurred, right? Someone reports anonymously that there's been issues around, let's say, if it's a consulting firm. So let's say it's a consulting firm, and then they have a lot of issues around lack of leadership support for some of the problems that they're having on this project, right? So this is non-existent, and they don't know which direction to take, and the project's going pair up. So they look at that issue. Well, what we do is we help them facilitate the root cause of that. So through our program, they can actually engage in a root cause analysis of what that individual person thinks is the driving force of this issue. And then we can present that to the company on a monthly or quarterly basis, or however they choose, to be able to then evaluate, okay, we understand these things are happening in our company, but we don't know why. But having a root cause tool on this perspective, in this human perspective, will then allow them to see the insights of what the people in their business are reporting as to why they think these problems are occurring. And so then they can actually say, oh, okay, now we can evaluate this report. We can see what the root cause problems potentially are. And then we can actually address those root causes without trying to guess. Because if it's helping the company not guess what their issues are in plain speak. You don't want to say, oh, well, we have a lot of issues on this team. They've got a project going. We've put in a couple $100 million to implement this IT software. They don't seem to get their act together to actually finalize the project. There's a lot of bugs, et cetera, et cetera. Well, why is it happening? So enabling and giving a tool for that company to then use that's based off of risk standards to then run a whole root cause analysis on that, and then giving that report out to the management team to then be able to evaluate what those causes are or what their team has perceived the root cause to be. It gives much more data and information to then base their decisions going forward as to what the right mitigation and management standards should be. And it alleviates a little bit of stress also on making a decision and pulling the trigger as to what to spend their money on. So that causes stress too, is, not knowing.
Right.
So then, you've got a leader who has to make a decision how to spend, I've got a budget. So I've got a couple $100 million. $1 million's got to go towards fixing problems. And so now I need to make a decision as to how to spend that $1 million on. And I don't want to guess. And I don't want it to be the wrong thing. So now I've been sold this by a really slick salesperson. And I've been sold this program and I've done this and I don't know if it's going to solve the problem or not.
And that brings us back beautifully to the physical world, right? So if you were running a real estate portfolio, you wouldn't just guess, well, which building's likely to collapse or have a problem, right? I'm going to send surveyors out.
Right.
And so you've got the equivalent of that for some of these programs. And maybe actually what I think is interesting about it is there's obviously things that you do that are targeting humans. So a lot of HR initiatives directly target, or comms would be a good example, right? We don't do internal comms for computers to hear the stuff, right? It's for human beings. So you've got those things that direct, but you've also got other aspects of programs that are indirectly affecting humans. So the implementation of a new IT system sounds like a kind of boxes and cables and microchips problem. But actually, it impacts people because people use those systems. And so you're looking for both, you get both of those two things come out.
The purpose of this is twofold. So the program allows the company to have the data and the information to make informed decisions around issues that are driven ultimately by people topics and people behavior. And then it also helps the individual privately to really understand also and identify what are the drivers of some of the issues they have, and then be matched with the right types of support to be able to manage and mitigate and correct or address or support, whatever it might be, to get them on the right foot and feel a little bit better, feel happier. So at the end of the day, you asked me, what does the leader get? We hope, our dream, our mission is for them to feel less stressed on a daily basis, to feel more in control of their life, and to feel a little bit freer and happier going forward.
Love it. I think that's something we can all buy into. Before I let you go, tell people, and I'll put links to all of these things in the show notes, but tell people how they can get hold of you.
So LinkedIn's actually the best way to get a hold of me. So I'm always happy to connect and receiving messages and happy to respond back. So LinkedIn, you can find me at Jennifer Thamm, Thamm. You can find us on sayslife.com, SAYSLIFE.com, Says Life.
Amazing. Well, look, I think this is really fascinating. And I think it's a very 21st century way of looking at a problem that has always existed and will continue to exist, which is how do we get the best out of our people and mitigate the risk they pose? So very on brand for human risk, but I think a fascinating way of going about it. And I love the way you're thinking about it and the way that you're solving what I think is one of the biggest challenges facing companies nowadays. So thank you firstly for doing that and for sharing ideas. And secondly, for being a great guest on the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun talking to you. I appreciate it. I'm more than happy to get involved in anything that you're doing and support you going forward.
Amazing.
Thanks, Christian.
That's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Jennifer for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Jennifer and her work at Says Life, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major platforms. To find out more about human risk and the work that I do with my clients, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.